Welcome to Ike's Flame. Join us on another Star Wars adventure. Punch it, Chewie.
Hello, my friends, and we are here for another Star Wars conversation. But surprisingly enough, this was not instigated by myself. This was instigated by Ike of Ike's Flame. And Ike and I have done a couple of collaborations in the past. I think it was last year in 2023 we had a couple. Since then, Ike has had Mark Thompson, the voice actor and audiobook narrator, on his show. So make sure you go check out that conversation. It's absolutely fantastic. And Ike had a little hiatus from podcasting because life stuff gets in the way. But he's come back with some absolute banger episodes in the start of 2024 that I've been thoroughly enjoying. So I'll include links to that sort of jazz in the description. But Ike very kindly reached out to me and asked if we could do another sort of Star Wars conversation, starting off with like spirituality again, because we had a really cool conversation last year. And so what we're going to do is this is going to be a nice, cool collaboration. So you're going to get the first half of the episode on this feed of Genuine Chit-Chat, and then you're going to get the other part on Ike's Flame. So it's the ultimate collaboration to make sure you subscribe to both of our feeds and have the best time. But Ike, you reached out to me, good sir. So what do you want to talk about? What made you reach out? Like, tell us. The platform is yours.
Yeah, definitely. First off, I always just love having a conversation with you about Star Wars, and have enjoyed our first few conversations we've had. So, it's just a joy to be able to do that. And then, I know when I don't know, it was the first time we recorded together, or maybe the second. I know we got into a little bit, and you asked me this question of, like, how does your spirituality connect with Star Wars or your religious background or whatever that. And so actually over the past few weeks, as I've been interviewing some people, this has kind of sparked my interest of like, hey, like, how do other people connect to Star Wars in a spiritual fashion, or whatever their religious background is. And so I was like, well, I should have you on, since you kind of sparked that idea on me, to kind of have some of these conversations. And sometimes it's just a short question within an interview of somebody who's doing cosplay or whatever. And as if you guys listen to my channel, like, one thing I talk about a lot is how amazing our Star Wars community is, and how we can find random people and talk to people about Star Wars, and how we connect, and how Star Wars has connected people. And so I think for me, it's just neat. And then this side of it for me has kind of struck me of like, like, this is a conversation I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, but there's some really interesting aspects when you look at spirituality within Star Wars.
I agree, and I'll say people need to check out. So as of recording this, part 1 is out, but by the time this releases, part 2 will be out, because I'm very excited for that episode that's dropping in a couple of days. You had a conversation with a chap called Andy, who I believe has there's an Instagram which I think is the Star Wars sort of library or something along those lines.
Yeah, and he has a YouTube channel and some other things as well. Yeah,
and he is like very, like, as in, you know, some people think that just because I'm British and loosely well spoken, that I'm quite an intelligent individual, and I'd say I'm not overly. But you hear like, and to evidence that point, you hear Andy speak about like religion and the rabbit hole he went down after Star Wars religion. And he talks about like Taoism and like Joseph Campbell's influence on George Lucas and the hero's journey and all this stuff. And I'm like, it's so fascinating. Like, I love talking Star Wars, and especially religion and things very intrigues me. But he went so deep into it, and he's so knowledgeable. So I'm saying, like, anyone who has any vague interest in religion or Star Wars or anything like that, I'll put a link in the description. And obviously, if you're on the feed of Ike's Flame after this, when you hear the other parts, make sure you go check that out, because it's such a cool conversation. I'm really cannot wait to hear the second part.
I will say, like, as I had that conversation with Andy, like, I was kind of blown away by like some of the things he was talking about, and just like it's things like I maybe knew, but he put more words to it, and it was just such a in-depth conversation. And I will say, like, we could have talked probably for a couple more hours with the rabbit holes we were going down and things like that. But yeah, so go listen to that. If you guys like Mike said, like, if you're just interested in that, it'll be a fun conversation to listen to. Not necessarily because I'm there, but just because the information that Andy gives, I was kind of blown away by the conversation. I'm like, this is so cool. And so yeah, just go check that out. It was really intriguing, and just really I mean, gave me a new view, I think, even on some things with Star Wars and especially relating it to spirituality. So
Mm.
yeah.
I agree, because I knew that Star Wars had some sort of very loose link to like Buddhism in some ways, but I think
Mhm.
Taoism is like connected to or parallel to Buddhism. Like my
Yeah.
knowledge of Taoism is next to none, and my knowledge of
Yeah.
Buddhism is quite limited anyway. But I know that there's been those comparisons to Star Wars. So
Mhm.
hearing someone say, like, literally explaining what it is and fully knowing what they're talking about, I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
hats off, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it was a really cool conversation. So yeah, so with that said, let's just kind of dive in for
Mm.
the like two of us. Like what maybe let's just start with like for you personally, I mean you can share as much as you're comfortable with, but like how have you related to Star Wars spiritually or religiously or and like what does that look like for you? And I mean what does that connection what's that connection you have?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I've been open about this sort of starting block of my life with Star Wars, and I'll explain it for anyone who hasn't listened to me talk about it before. But my dad passed away when I was 19, which is over 10 years ago now, and that was before the sequels were like they were. I think they were announced, but no trailer had dropped for Force Awakens. It was just before that kind of time, and so. I remember that when I grew up, like my dad always loved Harrison Ford. He
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be Indiana Jones. He wanted to be a Han Solo. Like anything Harrison Ford did, my dad was like really into. And back when I was a kid, Dad used to watch, normal TV, and on a TV channel. I can't remember which channel it was. I think it was channel 3 or 4. Every Friday they would play like a blockbuster movie. A lot of the time it'd be Spielberg, so it'd be like E.T. and stuff. There'd often be Jurassic Park, but then they do Indiana Jones 1, 2, 3, and then they do Star Wars 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And so I just remember numerous Fridays before I even really conceptualized what Star Wars was, Dad was always watching them, just whether he was actively watching them or reading a book or newspaper or something while it was on, it was just always loosely on. And then I remember going to the cinema, I think for Revenge of the Sith. I don't think I went for Attack of the Clones, or I definitely didn't for Phantom Menace, but I had them on VHS tape. Revenge of the Sith was the first DVD I ever owned. So, I'm only a few years older than you are. And so, we're both prequel babies, grew up with Star Wars. For us, the prequels have always been around. We never had the air quotes disappointment of Jar Jar and the, Phantom Menace being, weird compared to the originals, because by the time we were old enough to really figure out our own opinions, the prequels were already either in full swing or had finished that trilogy. So for us, it's never been that jarring. So with that, basically, I got into Star Wars. I used to like it as a kid when I was quite young, and then when I got a little bit older, because Revenge of the Sith came out, I was about 11ish. I kind of. When I first saw Revenge of the Sith, I wasn't as fussed by it, oddly enough. I was obsessed with Attack of the Clones, even though looking back, I think Revenge of the Sith is a far superior movie. So when I first saw Revenge of the Sith, I was like, this is all right. And then I rewatched it when I got it on DVD just to give it another go, and I fell in love with it, obsessed over it, and watched it like every day for weeks. And then Doctor Who got its rebirth with Christopher Eccleston, and then a year or so later with David Tennant, and that kind of was in the place of me liking Star Wars for a long time, because it came out 2005. That's when Revenge of the Sith came out, so it was quite an easy transition. But so I never watched Clone Wars when it was coming out. I watched the 2D animated one by Jaren Tartovsky or whatever it was, and it was all right, but I wasn't like super fussed about it. And so Star Wars kind of faded in the background a little bit for me. And then one thing that was keeping me going was, apart from my enjoyment of the original 6, but they for me were just like cool films I liked. But then some of the games came out, and I think you and I have a similar kind of connection with Star Wars with this. The video games really connected me. The Lego Star Wars games, including the Complete Saga. And then for me, it was like The Force Unleashed. And there were some other ones like Obi-Wan on original Xbox, Bounty Hunter, the Jango Fett game, like lots of those ones which were like really cool just excluding Star Wars being involved, just a lot of them are really cool games, or at least a lot of the time the first half are really cool, and then like Bounty Hunter, it just kind of falls apart a bit. And Jedi Outcast, those kind of games on GameCube, love those. And so it continued with me for that, and the spirituality side I never really thought about it. And then I was an atheist quite strongly in my teen years, especially when I went to college and things, and I learned about the multitude of atrocities in the world that have been caused by all kinds of religion, not any one in particular, but they've all had their dark spells. So I was very much against religion for a long time. And then after Dad got ill and then passed away, it took me a few years to kind of really deal with those emotions and stuff. And so in that time, I kind of started, thinking about other ideas a bit more, like opening my mind a little bit and thinking about the scientific side of spirituality in a way. We're all made, regardless of one's religious beliefs, we're all made of light or energy, as Yoda says. We're all made of this energy, and we're all connected. Whether or not you believe a God connects us, whether you believe it's the Big Bang or anything else, there is, at least in kind of any belief system, even science-based, we're all made from the same matter. There's all something connecting us. And when I kind of came into that worldview and I stopped thinking of people just dying and you die in the ground, get eaten by worms, and I kind of thought of it more like your consciousness, the energy that is your consciousness, dissipates and becomes one with the universe and just becomes one with everything. And I started to think about the kind of things my dad used to say, which is things like, Mozart is a part of everyone. And I was like, how does that make sense? And he's like, well, Mozart, his body, decomposed, and they got eaten by the worms, the grass, etc. And just over the centuries, inevitably, some of what made Mozart would have either got into the air or into, grass that's been eaten by cows or anything. It would have just somehow spread from just his physical form. And so when I started thinking about those things and certain other things he said, I was just kind of, no matter what scientific lens I put on it, no matter how completely abstaining from spirituality, I was always just like, there's energy connecting us. And I couldn't really shake that. And then when the sequels were announced and came out, obviously I was, so excited, so happy. A part of my childhood came back. There's a connection to my dad. Yeah. And I watched The Force Awakens, which I love and loved when I saw it at the cinema. And a lot of what happened was my connection with it changed a little bit, because in the sequels, they don't talk about the spirituality side quite as much. They don't really in the prequels either. It's more so the original, in the kind of, mainly in really Empire. It's a lot of Yoda stuff, he talks about it. And I remember when I was rewatching all the films and things, getting ready, Qui-Gon's teachings in Phantom Menace really spoke to me in a lot of ways, as did Yoda's. And then when I started, when I watched the Clone Wars, which I think was just it was around the time of my dad passing away, around the time of Force Awakens-ish. I can't remember the timelines exactly. But there's a few Clone Wars arcs which really detail about the spirituality, especially I think season 6 when Yoda goes off on his adventure, and there's the Mortis Gods arc and all these things. Yeah. And I was just like, there's so much here which I don't necessarily believe in. The Force is a I know the Jedi always say this, but it's not a power someone can control. I don't necessarily think that. Yeah. But there are a lot of things in this world we can't explain, and there's so many things in Star Wars which they talk about, which is just like really easy to understand, quite easy to conceptualize, spiritual ideas. And when that started to happen, I couldn't unsee that. And then as I've been reading more Star Wars and consuming more Star Wars content, especially the High Republic, which obviously you and I are both big fans of, and you see that each Jedi has their own interpretation of what the Force is. I personally connect with Elzar Mann the most, which is the currents of the ocean. I really like that. I like Avar Kriss and the song and things, but like that metaphor, and I've just been... Over the years, I've kind of had an almost spiritual renaissance. I've been talking to a lot of people about their religious beliefs, and it sparked one of our conversations. And I've just found that in a real simple, easy to conceptualize way, the way that Yoda describes the Force and the kind of binding part of it really just connected with me in a way that it doesn't have the same baggage that the issues I had when I was a teenager. I don't need to follow a book. I don't need to have any restrictions on my life. I don't need to worry about potential punishment or anything like that. It's really just about being one with the universe in a really simple way. And so that for me, kind of all of those things just connected together. And so now I'm just, am I agnostic? I don't know. Do I believe there's a deity? I don't really think so, but I've kind of come to the conclusion of like, maybe God does exist, but we're all just God. All of everything alive in this universe, are combined energy, the combined living force of everything makes up this giant, metaphysical brain, which could be construed as a God. And when I start going down these thought holes and stuff, I'm like, most ideas of most religions could be feasible even using that lens. So it's really, I would say that, obviously the passing of my dad was very tragic and that sort of thing, but it really did make me think about things in a very different way. And with my mind being more open to these kind of ideas, and especially with some of the stuff of the High Republic, and even some of the other books like Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray, that delves deep into Qui-Gon's beliefs and some of the prophecies and things. And I'm like, it's just it's a well that I keep tapping, but there's still so much there, and I just love it.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think I love kind of that you like shared kind of that journey for you of like where you were at, where you go, like where you kind of come from, where you've been, and kind of things that were the catalyst for that of even just starting to kind of open your eyes to see like, hey, maybe there is something different, or maybe just being willing to, I think, hear or listen, and I think it's maybe just start to see things in a different light. And so I appreciate you, like, yeah, you're just like kind of walk us through that. I think that journey for you, because everybody has a different journey or a different way they eventually could connect to spirituality, or what, depending on what their upbringing or the events that happen to them in life. And so yeah, and I definitely think, I know kind of some of our conversation did start with like the High Republic and kind of the spiritual sense that they dive into in the High Republic novels and everything. And so I think it started to, I think, and that was part of the reason that kind of sparked me too a little bit. I started thinking about like some of the things they talked about in the High Republic, and it's like makes it very intriguing, where it dives into more of that spiritual side of Star Wars that we don't necessarily see always in the movies. We get glimpses of it. We get a little bit more of it in Clone Wars, and some of those even in Rebels and some of the TV shows, but we then kind of start diving into it. And I think it's interesting that it's one of those things I find it's hard to ignore a little bit within Star Wars when you have this idea of the Force. And so it makes you think about it a little bit. And so I just find that very intriguing, as that we've kind of, I don't know, evolved in the Star Wars universe of where creators are going with it and how everything's connecting in that sense. And I mean, I even think like Mandalorian, like the Mandalorian religion, I mean, put air quotes around that. I don't know. I don't think they would necessarily call it a religion, but just their culture and the things they subscribe to as a people. And so like we've been able to dive into that a lot more over the past few years with the Mando shows. And so that's also been interesting. And we even get to see like Boba Fett, or Boba Fett even ascribes to that. I mean, like when he pulls up, I think of specifically the episode where he pulls up the chain code in his armor, and he's like, "Hey, like this is who I am. This is where this is who my dad was, and like, but I'm gonna abide by what these rules that I was taught, and still help you out, or whatever, what that exact situation." But like, so it's been interesting to see the Star Wars kind of creators dive into that, even if it's just glimpsing it. It seems to be more of a prevalent thing that has, I think, taken place within the Star Wars universe over the past 5 to 10 years, I would say.
No, I agree with you completely. And it's like, your conversation with Strike on your pod, the episodes before you spoke with Andy, he makes some very good points about speaking about like the Mandalorians and things. And you've just brought it up there. And it's always something that my favorite part, like I enjoyed Mandalorian series 1, 2, and 3, each one for different reasons. I personally, controversially, think season 1 is my least favorite.
Okay.
It's cool, but it's very episode of the week. But for me, I was like, season 2's got the heavy hitters of the plot and the action and stuff like that. And season 3, although it was quite uneven, it did have some episodes that were really interesting, and it's the creed of the Mandalorians is something which I hadn't overtly connected with spirituality, but because of what you've just said there and thinking about your conversation with Strike as well, it is a really interesting sort of connection there. Like the spirituality in Star Wars, although it's deep rooted, I think, in the Force in a lot of ways, Mandalorians are not overtly, they're not worshipping the Force, but a lot of Mandalorian culture is formed by the wars that they had with Force users. I'm sure yourself, you are aware of this. I think you are because we've discussed it, but some of the listeners may not be aware if they haven't consumed a lot of content outside the movies and some of the series. The majority of Mandalorian armor and fighting style was developed directly to fight the Jedi. So it's literally like the culture of Mandalorians being warriors is burnt, at least in the canon, is burnt from the Holy Wars, essentially. These clashing ideologies about how the world is, how you're meant to be in the world. And so a lot of the identity of Mandalorians are actually a counter to what the Jedi are like. And obviously, if we go into sort of legends, and I'm sure in things like Dawn of the Jedi and some as canon widens more and we get more into the Sith, because the Sith has barely been touched in the canon at the moment. We get little sprinklings in legends, with the Darth Bane trilogy and like things like Revan and stuff like that. When you delve into it, you realize the Sith were they were just Jedi that disagreed with the other Jedi. They basically were exiled. They disappeared. They were just called kind of like Dark Jedi for a while, and then they end up connecting with the Sith species. And then over a long time, they eventually changed their kind of outlook and their perceptions. And when you see what the Sith believe and what the Jedi believe, they're very, very similar. It's almost like it's just some minor tweaks that are different. Like when you get into like some of the Vader comics and some of the content with Palpatine and Vader, a lot of what Palpatine does is just sit around meditating and hearing the call of the Force. But what the kind of difference between the Sith and the Jedi is like the Jedi are kind of like, oh, I hear what the Force wants and I kind of follow it. Whereas Palpatine is more like, I hear what the Force wants and I forcibly can change it to my will and make it want what I want in a way. And I think that ideology as well is one that could be seen as a parallel from multitude of religions. When you get some of the more extreme individuals in religion or some of the more pacifists in just general, just not pointing my finger at any religion in particular, but like the general idea of a lot of maybe the Abrahamic ones, it's quite interesting again that this perception changes. And I'd be intrigued to know sort of your thoughts on like the Mandalorian culture and maybe any of those kind of connections, because it's a very good point.